a rollicking tour through the scandalous bedroom antics of several notorious monarchs. King John of England. Imagine a dimly lit great hall somewhere in an English casa circa the early 1200s. Heavy oaken doors groan on their hinges as courtiers shuffle about, anxious to catch the king's eye or merely hopeful for a scrap of royal favor. Into this tense, musty atmosphere strides John, nicknamed Lachlan, by siblings who deemed his inheritance petty, but soon to become infamous for far darker reasons. He inherited a realm battered by his brother Richard the Lionheart's wars, and yet instead of healing those wounds, John treated suffering families like little more than convenient pawns in his relentless pursuit of pleasure and profit. What follows is not a story of chivalric, grandeur, or enlightened governance, but of a ruler whose personal appetites and political machinations blended into a uniquely corrosive power. Trip one that ignited baronial rebellions and stained his reign forever. Chroniclers record at least 30 official mistresses, noblewomen on the record, but whispers claim the actual tally stretched far beyond that, including ladies-in-waiting servants, and perhaps one unfortunate baron's goat. If the most scurrilous rumors are true, he notoriously abducted female relatives of disfavored barons, sequestering them in royal castles under the guise of hospitable guest quarters. There, he entertained them until families capitulated, offering land or gold for their safe release or simply surrendered to exile or convenient imprisonment. If a baron resisted his matrimonial incursions, his punishment followed swiftly. Double or triple taxation, arbitrary levies, fines, for imagined offenses. The Exchequer ledgers from 1207 to 1214 bulge with entries like £500 for the king's entertainment of Lady M. It wasn't only the financial burdens or the moral outrage, it was the pervasive sense that a king could abuse power with utter impunity, trampling on the old feudal compact, bed-bound monarch and magnate alike, and £300 for the king's expenses following refusal of hospitality. Such sums could bankrupt a lesser nobleman. That was precisely the point. Clause 42 is particularly striking. No man shall be forced to take lodgings in our castle if he does not wish. An explicit rebuke of the king's practice of billeting himself and his desires at noble expense. Yet John's signature was never meant to be sincere. He revoked the charter within months, plunging England into civil war. Still, the precedent was set. Even a king had to respect certain boundaries. John's view of women as political prizes corroded the very notion of fealty. Their grievances ranged from exorbitant scutage to personal affronts, noble houses stripped of daughters, estates diminished, and honor broadcastly violated. Illegitimate children scattered across England's islands of loyalty, none saved from the stigma of being a king's conveniently forgotten offspring. Contemporary letters even describe baronial wives refusing royal summons, barricading themselves behind locked doors, or demanding armed guards an unprecedented challenge to regal prerogative. His chroniclers, uncomfortable even by medieval standards steeped in violence, sheepishly noted he did not abstain from daughters, describing with rare restraint what was clearly sexual coercion on a grand scale. Yet this wasn't romantic dalliance. It was a cold, methodical tool of Historians remember him not as the signatory of Magna Carta, but as a cautionary tale. Unchecked power begets collapse. And a king who treats subjects like serfs for sexual sport invites by seducing a noble wife. John weakened a family's power base, then slapped on punitive taxes once the husband's honor was in tatters. Why batter their castles when I can batter their marriages? Seemingly became his motto. It's another to imagine the terrified whispers among noble women waiting in dank chambers, the shame that clung to entire families, and the climate of fear that permeated castle corridors. John's behavior left invisible scars. A reign defined by personal excess. From the moment John ascended the throne in 1199, the kingdom sensed that something in the tone of English kingship had shifted. Mistress collection, as statecraft John's romantic resume would make even the most jaded modern gossip columnist gape. Kitten appendantry tactics when diplomacy failed. John didn't send envoys, he sent emissaries of a different sort. Taxation as retribution. For John, courtship and commerce were inseparable. Baronial backlash and Magna Carta by the second decade of the 13th century. Even England's most loyal lords had had enough. Rebellion ignited by scandal in late 1214. A coalition of barons marched on London, not to depose John entirely, that came later, but to force concessions. Magna Carta, 1215. Under siege at Runnymede in June 12, John reluctantly affixed his seal to the Magna Carta. The personal toll of a predator king. It's one thing to tally abductions and double taxes and dusty rolls. Erosion of trust. Barons no longer trusted royal hospitality. Knights refused summons. Courts became theaters of whispered counsel rather than open justice. Dynastic uncertainty. The question, who might be John's next target, haunted every alliance but also tainted his own line. Legacy of infamy. When John died in October 12, 16, fallen ill during a campaign to reclaim rebellious French territories, he left no shining legacy. Charles V, the Mad of France. Picture the vaulted chambers of the Louvre in the early 15th century. Tapestries muted by flickering candlelight. Courtiers glancing nervously at one another as the echoes of distant footsteps approach. Into this charged, hush-lumbrous King Charles, once lauded as a promising young sovereign, now a haunted figure draped in padded blankets, convinced he'll shadow like delicate crystal if his skin is touched by even a dew. This is the reign of Charles V, the Mad, a tragic performance of power, paranoia, and perverse court spectacle. From promising prince to paranoid sovereign, early reign and sudden deterioration at age 10. Charles inherited the crown amid the 100 Years' War's turmoil. He became convinced his bones were fragile like blown glass. He refused to ride horses, fearing the slightest jolt would crack him. Courtiers reported seeing him crawl on padded carpets in fits of terror. His bed was encased in pillows. His chamberlain carried the king in a custom litter. At public ceremonies, he dared not stand, preferring to be seated atop a throne of bolstered cushions so cumbersome that state processions slowed to a crawl. His early years seemed auspicious. Scholars praised his intellect, and envoys admired his composed diplomacy. The Queen Isabeau of Bavaria was sidelined completely. She functioned as regent in name only. Ministers tiptoed around the king's delusions rather than pressing critical decisions. Ambassadorial letters grumbled that one must petition Madame Odette before petitioning His Majesty, a bizarre inversion of courtly protocol that enriched her family and deepened factional rivalries. But by the mid-1380s, the court observed strange behaviors. The young king would abruptly abandon councils, insisting a spider on his sleeve foretold betrayal, or that a stray mirror reflected enemy agents plotting regicide. The glass delusion. By 1395, Charles's paranoia crystallized literally into the notorious glass delusion. Nobles clad in stone-wax suits danced around easels of blazing torches. The spectacle was intended to embody fearless chivalry conquering nature's fury. Instead, it became a fatal conflagration. Despite the carnage, he reportedly remarked, a spectacle well matched to life's hazards. The court fell into a macabre gloom. Dancers and jesters alike vanished from the leveled courtyard for weeks. Nobles refused invitations, fearing the next amusement might be their death. Eyewitness accounts described nobles screaming as flames leaped through brittle straw, burning skin within seconds. He left behind 12 children, some conceived in lucid intervals. Others, perhaps the product of a king who couldn't always remember his own bed. Historians remember him less for statecraft than as the monarch haunted by his body's imagined fragility. A cautionary tale. Unbridled paranoia can shatter more than glass. Into this lush stage strides Peter of Castile. Handsome, charming, but possessed of a cruelty so intimate it blurred the line between romance and vendetta. His reign became a theater of obsessive jealousy, secret weddings, and violent retribution drama worthy of a stage, yet fatally real for those caught in his embrace. 24 courtiers perished. Several highborn survivors bore lifelong scars. Though politically bound to marry Blanche of Bourbon for alliance, he secretly wedded Maria in a twilight ceremony, an act both romantic and scandalous. To Peter, Maria was his true queen. To the court, she was the phantom queen, granting her influence in whispered council meetings behind closed doors. His chronic anxiety permeated all levels of French society. Commoners heard whispers that even God might snap him like glass, fueling superstition. Clerics petitioned for exorcisms. Physicians offered potions to harden his bones. Yet nothing quelled the king's terror. Stripped of title and contact, the forsaken queen languished in solitude, her name struck from court records, her very existence treated as a mere footnote. Her imprisonment sent a clear message. Peter answered only to his passions, not to dynastic duty, courtly scandal, and royal comfort. Captured en route, she was brought back and chain sentenced to a public whipping before being reinstated as comfort to the king. This brazen display of power reinforced Peter's credo. Personal autonomy was a privilege he alone could grant. Installed as Charles's comfort, she endured his extreme rituals, brushing his hair strand by trembling strand, guiding him gingerly to wash boxes filled with distilled rose water and helping him into his cotton-padded safety tunic each morning. Odette's quarters lay directly off the king's bed. Attendants whispered that her gilded door never closed. Civil war erupted, drawing in the King of Aragon and even the English plant. For 2 decades, Castile bled not over religion or territory, but over one man's unbridled personal vendetta. Yet beneath this surface of luxury lay an iron fist. Any noble who challenged his authority risked property, confiscation, exile, or execution. Lawsuits vanished overnight. Judges sentenced on royal whim. Odette de Foix, Odechidezon, poets mourned his lost Maria. Ballades recounted his whim-driven massacres. To some, he was a romantic martyr betrayed by fate. To others, the epitome of tyrannical excess. In Iberian lore, Peter the Cruel remains a byword for when love and power collide in catastrophic cruelty. Legend holds that his own cousin, Henry, have struck the fatal blow. Henry, claiming, "I cut down the man who cut out so many hearts." Peter's body was thrown unceremoniously into a river, his head displayed as a grim trophy. His erratic presence on the throne undermined continuity of command. Field captains received royal orders transmitted via Odetsio, leading to conflicting instructions that fractured armies. Others hinted foul play. Consumed by grief and rage, he declared his legal marriage to Maria, ordered the execution of Blanche's courtiers, and publicly displayed their severed heads on castle gates. Each gruesome tableau served as both warning and spectacle. Betray or ignore the king's heart at your peril. England seized the initiative, retaking Normandy in 1415 following Charles's death. Into this atmosphere of hysterical fragility stepped Odette Decem, a young noble woman of discreet pedigree. Political implications. Unlike most royal affairs, Charles's delusional need for Odette had tangible effects on governance. The Bal d'Yrden, a pyrotechnic nightmare, a court entertainment gone wrong in 1400. Charles hosted the so-called Bal d'Yrden, his attempt at a wild men mask and flammable costumes. Aftermath and court morale, the king, ensilated in his protective skirt of layered padding, watched from a balcony above so close that embers fell onto his cloak. Legacy of madness and governance, military and diplomatic costs. While Charles battled his inner demons, the 100 Years' War raged on. Human toll beyond lost battles and burned courtiers, Charles's reign inflicted far deeper wounds. Death and historical judgment. Charles V died in September 1422, aged just. Peter the Cruel of Castile. Envision the grand halls of Seville in mid-14th century Spain, gleaming marble floors, courtiers reclining on silk cushions, the scent of orange blossom in the air. A secret marriage with deadly consequences. Maria de Padilla, the woman he could not forget early in his reign. Peter fell fiercely for Maria de Padilla, a noble woman celebrated for her wit and beauty. Blanche of Bourbon, castle prisoner, barely 3 days after his official wedding to Blanche. Peter had her locked away in the remote castle of Elite. Violent jealousy and public execution. Murda's political theater. Peter's love turned lethal when Maria died under mysterious. Among Peter's later companions was Juana de Castro, another noble woman who dared to flee his court when his temper turned stormy. Courtly splendor and tyranny, lavish palaces and brutal decrees, though infamous for his ruthlessness. Peter also invested heavily in architectural splendor, gold leaf ceilings, and private gardens, stocked with exotic birds. Factional warfare, his cruelty, fractured Castilian politics. Loyalists to Blanche and the French crown plotted his downfall, while Maria's supporters rallied in secret. Assassination and enduring reputation, death by conspiracy. In 1369, as Peter prepared to quell Protestant uprisings in the north, a coalition of exiled nobles ambushed him near. Legacy of blood and romance. Castile remembers Peter not as the founder of dynasties, but as the king whose passions became his sword. Edward II of England slipped into the candlelit corridors of Nottingham Castle in the dead of winter. 1320 snowflakes drift against narrow windows, muffling the echoes of armored footsteps. Inside, King Edward II sits brooding by a small brazier, more withdrawn from governance than from the biting cold. His court, once brimming with knights and nobles, has instead become a stage for his intimate dramas. Intense devotion to male favorites, courtly feuds, and a queen driven to desperate measures. This is the reign of Edward II, where politics and passion intertwined with ruinous effect. Piers Gaveston, childhood friend or royal consort, early favoritism from boyhood. Edward and Piers Gaveston were inseparable. When Edward ascended in 1307, one of his first acts was to recall Piers from exile and bestow upon him the earldom of Cornwall, an honorific outrage. Given Cornwall's traditional linkage to the crown, courtiers whispered that the king's affection went far beyond mere camaraderie. Lavish gifts and provocative titles. Piers arrived in court garbed in gaudy silks imported from Gascony, his arms heavy with rings and necklaces. He was granted estates, high office, and even the king's private chambers. Marching on London, they demanded Hugh's banishment and the restoration of confiscated lands. Edward's response was swift and vindictive. He declared them traitors, stripped rebels of titles, and executed several lords without trial. Legal norms, shredded under the banner of royal passion. Originally his child bride, by the early 1320s, she found herself sidelined as Despenser's influence eclipsed hers. Frustrated by her husband's indifference and Hugh's bullying, Isabella allied covertly with Roger Mortimer, another exiled noble whose daughter Despenser had guilted on. Plotted the king's down. Nobles seethed. Is this the heir to the throne, or his consort? Many saw his elevation as a slap to the traditional order, an affront that boldly declared, The king answers to no, Baron solely to peers. Baronial backlash. Baron steered as the deposed king shuffled through Westminster Hall. His royal robes exchanged for plain garments. Popular support rallied quickly. Starving peasants and dispossessed knights joined her banner. Chroniclers hint at a red-hot poker used for medical purposes, though no conclusive evidence survives. Whether natural causes or foul play, his end symbolized the peril of a king who placed private devotion above statecraft. King Edward's forces melted away. Despenser fled and was captured, tortured, and hanged. Before a jeering crowd, in 1308, a coalition of magnates compelled Edward to exile peers. But the king's grief was genuine. Sources describe Edward collapsing in tears amid his council, begging to bring peers home. Yet this narrative of romance cannot obscure the real damage wrought by blending personal obsession with the levers of power. They demanded that future monarchs respect, counsel, and legal process, foundations that would resurface in later struggles over Magna Carta and parliamentary authority. Within months, the exile was reversed. This cycle of favoritism and baronial outrage would repeat, each episode corroding both trust and effective governance. His reign stands as a stark reminder: when a sovereign allows intimate passion to govern public policy, the realm itself fractures and no throne, however high, can withstand that fall. Hugh Despenser, the Younger. Second in dangerous devotion, in the center lounges a young king draped in velvety handsome, multilingual prince hailed at his coronation. Yet as the wine flows and music drifts across stone vaults, his courtiers soon realize that for King Wenceslaus, appearances mask deeper chaos. A sovereign who governs through drunken brawls, public nudity, and feuds settled with dueling Yet almost immediately, reports emerged amid council meet binges. Ministers petitioned in vain for sober deliberation. Instead, they found the throne room transformed into a tavern, advisors slurring proclamations and scribes dozing on ledgers. Royal edicts came stamped not with the king's seal, but with wine rings on parchment. Chronicles recount that after his third flask, Wenceslaus declared tax policy based on the sweetness of each grape variety, sparking baronial fury when barley farmers were taxed out of existence. This is the reign of Wenceslaus of Bohemia where royal decorum dissolves into boozy absurdity. One chronicler describes an evening when Wenceslaus, provoked by a noble's criticism of his dancing, stripped naked and challenged a man to a dual-wielding, oversized bread. The court spilled into the courtyard, torches gleaming off bare flesh, until royal guards equally inebriated dragged both combatants into the moat as onlookers roared with laughter. Visiting ambassadors later complained that even our viziers blushed, while villagers outside whispered that the king's naked justice was both literal and humiliating. New favorite, renewed turmoil after Piers's execution in 1312 by rebellious barons. Edward turned to Hugh Despenser, the Younger and other companion whose rise mirrored. Gaveston's Despenser accumulated land and offices at alarming speed, often by literally seizing neighboring estates or persuading the king to annul prior grants. In one infamous episode, he summoned the entire court's female staff to tasting panels, sampling home-brewed ales and scandalizing nobles when he lavished titles on the winning brewer's daughter. Despenser's War by 1321. Baronial frustration exploded into the Despenser War. At a compelled diet, they stripped him of the Bohemian crown. The deposition was humiliating. The naked Edict king, now demoted to princely sobriety. He died in 1419 under circumstances as murky as his reign, some say of liver failure. Others claim assassination by a disgruntled Historians remember him less as an emperor and more as that monarch who governed by hangover, a cautionary emblem of what befalls a throne surrendered to excess. Family enmity. Even Edward's queen, Isabella of France, grew alarmed. The king's successor, I paid for her education in diplomacy and desert wines, led to a month-long standoff at the border until an embarrassed papal legate brokered a truce by offering the duke an honorary barrel of royal mead. The fall, imprisonment, deposition, and death. Isabella and Mortimer's invasion in 1326. Queen Isabella landed in England with a small force ostensibly to mediate Despenser's tyranny, but in truth, to seize power. Edward's deposition stripped of his favorites and his dignity. Edward was coerced into abdicating in January 1327 in favor of his son, Edward III. Then just mysterious death, imprisoned at Berkeley Castle. Edward II died or was martyred later that year. Legacy of passion and power, political instability. Edward II's reign accelerated the English nobility's insistence on limiting royal absolutism. Romantic and cultural resonance, medieval ballads, and later plays cast Edward and Gaveston as tragic lovers. Their story, echoing through literature as an early portrayal of same-sex devotion. Final reflection in the silent cells of Berkeley. A king, broken by his own desires, faded into shadow. Wenceslaus of Bohemia. Close your eyes and imagine the flickering torchlight in the Great Hall of Prague Castle around the turn of the 15th century. The monarch and his mead. from promise to public drunkenness. When ascended as King of Bohemia in 1378, hopes were high. An educated ruler, fluent in Czech, German, French, and Latin, royal wine cellar, and policy by pint. Wenceslas favored the royal cellar so much that he effectively outsourced governance to a courtly vintner whom he elevated to jug-bearing advisor. Streaking through the Senate courtly brawls and breadstick duels in the boisterous fever of a late-night feast, disagreements rarely ended in polite words. Public edicts, in the nude. Not content with private spectacles, Wenceslas sometimes issued summons and charters while entirely unclad, save for a single jeweled sword belt. Amours of the ale-scented court barmaids, laundresses, and the occasional noblewoman, Wenceslas showed scant discrimination in matters of the heart. His liaisons ranged from palace washer women to foreign envoys' wives, whom he reportedly evaluated based on beer recommendations rather than lineage. Political fallout. These indiscretions weren't merely salacious gossip. When Wenceslas bedded the daughter of a powerful Silesian duke, the duke demanded her return and threatened war. Deposition in the shadow of madness, unfit to rule by 1400. Bohemian nobles formally proclaimed Wenceslas incapable of governing, citing chronic inebriation and indecent behavior. Life in exile and lasting reputation. Wenceslas spent his final years shuttling between insolvent courts, his retinue reduced to a few loyal ale merchant companions. Henry VIII of England. Imagine the grand banqueting hall at Whitehall Palace in mid-1535. Long tables groaning under roasted boar and silver flagons of wine. Courtiers in sumptuous silks, jockeying for royal attention. At the high table sits Henry VIII, broad-shouldered, red-bearded, and exuding raw charisma. Yet beneath his swagger lies a volatile mix of hormones and hubris that turned his marital bed into a corrosive battleground where wives were cast aside, heads rolled, and an entire church was appended to satisfy his desires. For 2 decades, she bore him a daughter, and served as regent in his absence. Her piety and political skills earning widespread respect. Catherine of Aragon. From devoted queen to discarded consort, convinced that their marriage was cursed by God, he became obsessed with he pressured universities for theological support, anxious that without a son, his dynasty would crumble. 20 years of marriage in 1509. The 19-year-old Henry wed Catherine of Aragon, widow of his brother Arthur. The heir obsession. Despite Catherine's loyalty, Henry's restless appetite for a male heir grew. Convinced that their marriage was cursed by God, he became obsessed with he pressured universities for theological support, anxious that without a son, his dynasty would crumble. The break with Rome. England's break with Rome followed swiftly. Henchmen closed monasteries, confiscated church lands, and executed dissent. The personal became national. One man's lust upended centuries of religious tradition. When Pope Clement VII refused to void the marriage, Henry seized the moment. In 1533, he elevated Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury, declared his own marriage null, and married Anne Boleyn. Passions poisoned, chalice, courtly, seduction. Anne Boleyn, Anne of the witty smile and dark eyes, captivated Henry in 1526. She refused his first proposals of marriage, insisting he woo her properly. That very defiance inflamed his Desirant, led to an increasingly tyrannical purge of officials who stood in his way. Queen and mother to a daughter. In January 1533, Henry secretly wed. By June, Cranmer crowned her queen, yet Anne, like Catherine before her, produced only a daughter. Her failure to give a son of fate, shared with her predecessor, proved fatal. Frances I of France. Sultry summer air drapes over the Loire Valley as you enter the newly completed Château de Chambord, its double helix staircase, barely cooled by the morning breeze. Inside, Francis I holds court beneath soaring ceilings, painted with mythic scenes. He is the embodiment of the Renaissance prince, a patron of Leonardo da Vinci and builder of grand palaces. But behind the cultured facade, his greatest conquest wasn't on the battlefield or in the art studio, it was the hearts. Gentlewomen of the Queen's Chamber, whose official duty was embroidery, in practice, his short list of potential consorts. Entire diplomatic missions hinged on whether Francis could meet Lady X at a ball. Ambassadors reported that one official visit from the Ottoman envoy was used primarily to introduce a Turkish noblewoman to the king. The treaty was signed only after Francis is properly entertained of foreign dignitaries, ladies-in-waiting, and anyone who caught his charismatic. This is the reign of Francis II, when political alliances were brokered as is alley in the boudoir as on the battlefield. Yet the king's patronage extended beyond architecture and music. When a famed sculptor introduced his daughter, Diane de Poitiers, to Francis in 1522, the match was immediate. Her rise sparked jealousy among rival factions, with pamphlets accusing her of poisoning His Majesty's ear against the Pope. Yet Francis defended her publicly. If my heart leads me to favor, who am I to argue with love's counsel? He showered Diane with jewels crafted by Benvenuto, had her apartments redecorated in his favorite black velvet, and granted her the Chateau d'If. From artist studio to royal bedroom, creativity and carnal appetite merged seamlessly. Courtly Cupid, a state-funded dating app. The rivalry reached its height at the Battle of Pavia, where Francis was captured. In captivity, his captors treated him with the same deference. He showed his mistresses providing fine clothes, embroideries, even a portable studio for his miniatures. Yet he longed not for art supplies, but for Diane's letters, which he claimed tasted sweeter than any Burgundian wine. Love alliances as foreign policy long before social media. Francis turned his court into a matchmaking network. To pay a tan to fund palaces for Diane, the king sold church lands and imposed new taxes on salt and wine. Public discontent grew, yet his popularity among artists and feminists soared. Better to starve under a lover-esque gaze than live fat in a loveless peace, quipped one court poet. Diplomatic fallout, yet the treasury by his death in 1547, the crown was deeply in debt, and his son Henry II inherited both magnificent castles and a fragile economy. When Francis bedded the wife of the Venetian ambassador, the ambassador's protest was politely ignored. His Majesty demands hospitality be extended, the court official assured him, but historians also mark him as the first modern monarch to wield romance's blending diplomacy, art, and adultery into a single, dazzling spectacle. In the annals of power and passion, Francis I remains the prototype, Renaissance despot, a king who built empires in Stonehenge in the hearts of his many, many lovers. Venice, deeply offended, revoked trading privileges for 6-month crippling French merchants. Frances's retort, overheard in the gallery, was classic. A treaty I can remake, a heart I collect once. The art of the affair, from Leonardo to lavish gifts, patronage, and passion. Francis's court drew luminaries, poets, and philosophers flocked to Blois and Fontainebleau. Political leverage, Diane's influence ran deep. As Francis's mattress and tighter for over 40 years, she negotiated noble marriages, swayed court appointments, and even moderated the king's harshest edicts. The Battle of the Bedchamber and the battlefield. Francis versus Charles V. Francis wooed wives and daughters of European powers. He was simultaneously locked in mortal struggle with Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Ransom and return. The colossal ransom of 3 million constrained, the royal coffers, legacy of a loverking cultural, flourishing, and fiscal ruin. Under Francis's rule, France became a beacon of Renaissance culture. Fontainebleau and the French art of courtly love all date from his era. Memory and myth to posterity. Francis is lauded as the patron who imported Leonardo's Mona Lisa and perhaps even desired her likeness for his private chambers. Alfonso XI of Castile. Picture the fortified walls of Seville in the early 14th century. Banners snapping in the spring breeze. The scent of orange groves drifting through arched windows. Within, Alfonso XI, known as the Avenger, for his military prowess at the head of a long table. Yet despite his reputation on the battlefield, his most notorious campaigns were waged in the chambers of his palace, where he waged a private war on marital duty in favor of a single, all-consuming passion, a queen ignored in the royal household, Maria of Portugal, a diplomatic bride in 1328. Alfonso married his cousin, Maria of Portugal, in a union designed to cement alliances on the peninsula. Chronicles note that she ate separately, in subdued company, while the king held boisterous feasts and hunting parties. Diplomats, puzzled, recorded that the queen was respected in name, but absent in affection, a living emblem of Alfonso's disregard for dynastic duty. Maria was accomplished, devout, and brought a substantial dowry, yet she found herself shunted aside almost immediately. Their affair, initially clandestine, quickly became public knowledge. Alfonso built her a palace at Castile, Edge, and installed her as Maîtresse en Titre, a shadow queen whose influence would grow unchecked. Alfonso, ever the soldier king, had little interest in conjugal harmony. Instead, he devoted himself to courtly pleasures and military campaigns, a marriage of convenience. In 1340, when Alfonso led the Reconquista campaign against the Maronite armies at he entrusted the kingdom to her stewardship. Leonor's regency was marked by efficient justice, the suppression of corruption, and a flurry of favorable marriages many arranged to reward her supporters. Maria's father, King Afonso IV of Portugal, protested vigorously. His daughter's mistreatment was an affront to the Portuguese crown. Tensions simmered until 1344, when Portugal mobilized troops along the border, demanding honors for the lawful queen. Skirmishes erupted at provincial estates, with confiscations of lands and sporadic duels. Yet Alfonso consistently sided with his mistress's supporters, issuing edicts that favored her clients and punishing dissenters with exile, fines, or forced service in Granada, effective means of removing political opponents. Alfonso, undeterred, pointedly invited his father-in-law to dinner where Leonor presided as hostess. The standoff ended only when papal legates brokered a truce, allowing Leonor to retain her palace and prerogatives. At state functions, Maria sat at Alfonso's side, dignified and composed, but never in his confidence. Leonor de Guzman, mistress turned power broker, their first encounter. Leonor de was a young noblewoman of sharp intellect and equal beauty, cast into Alfonso's orbit during the 30s. Mistress, as regent, his affair with Leonor de is remembered not merely as scandalous, but as a case where personal passion reshaped political structures, triggered international crises, and left Castile with wounds that outlasted his victories, whether prompted by Leonor's political ambition or his own conscience. He began to distance himself. Leonor, once omnipotent, found her lands quietly reclaimed, her allies stripped of titles. In 1350, Alfonso formally banished her to the remote castle of Carmona. Leonor negotiated treaties, managed estates, and even commanded troops in Alfonso's absence. Court rivalries and international tension. Alfonso XI, determined to maintain morale, refused to flee. He tended his subjects in plague wards and led a relief expedition only to contract the disease himself. On April 26, 1350, the once vibrant king died at his camp near Gibraltar, leaving his realm in shock and his mistress in exile. Maria, restored in title, but powerless in practice, withdrew to a convent. Leonor retreated to Carmona, dying under a cloud of fated influence. His legitimate heir, Peter I, inherited a fractured nobility and a treasury drained by tribute to Leonor's faction. Portugal on the brink of war. Maria's relatives in Portugal seethed at Leonor's elevation. Aristocratic factions within Castile's nobility. Two camps emerged. The Maria faction, championing dynastic legitimacy, and the party, loyal to Leonor's administration. A love affair ended by plague. Leonor's fall from favor by 1348. Alfonso's affections cooled. Death in the time of Black Death. That same year, the Black Death swept through Seville. Enduring scars on the Castilian crown, dynastic and political aftershocks, Alfonso left behind a kingdom divided. Historical judgment. Historians view Alfonso XI's reign as a study in contrast. Martial glory on the fields of Granada versus moral ambiguity in his domestic sphere. Philip, for the fair of France. Imagine the hushed corridors of the Louvre in early 14th century Paris. Torchlight dancing off alabaster walls as courtiers exchanged furtive glances. King Philip IV, nicknamed the Fair for his pale, aristocratic visages seated upon a throne of black oak. His reputation for legal reform and fiscal acumen precedes him. Yet beneath that veneer lies a sovereign, whose personal scandals would erupt into the most infamous sex and power trial of his era. The Tour de Nesle affair. In Philip's France, hypocrisy was royal policy and private indulgence could trigger public catastrophe. A pious image, a hypocritical court, public piety, and private indulgence. In 1313, rumors began that Margaret and Blanche consorted with two Burgundian knights, Gautier and Philippe d'Aunay, while Joan remained above reproach. Overheard late-night trysts in the Tour de Nesle tower ignited a blaze of gossip that no amount of royal decorum could smother. Philip cultivated an austere image. He championed moral reform, founded the University of Paris's theology faculty, and enforced strict sumptuary laws limiting ostentatious dress among the nobility. Yet at court, the king's own appetites ran deep. Chroniclers whisper that several of his trusted advisors, men handpicked for orthodox private houses of negotiation in the Loire Valley, where the king himself was rumored to visit incognito for discreet liaisons under the guise of pilgrimage. The two knights were publicly tortured, strappato, bastonado, and the water ordeal until confessions were wrested free. Margaret and Blanche were stripped of their crowns, their hair shorn in humiliation, and condemned to life imprisonment in Chateau Galliarda, previously impregnable fortress turned royal penitentiary. Joan's preservation was a calculated gesture. Philip as well, that at least one branch of the Capetian line remained undefiled. Philip's eldest son, Louis X, impatient to restore honor, hastily divorced Margaret and remarried Henri, to die weeks later, fueling rumors of divine vengeance. The Tour de Nesle prelude. The scandal centered on Philip's daughters-in-law Margaret, Blanche and Joan, married, respectively, to his sons Louis, Philip, and Charles. The royal investigation, covert surveillance, determined to root out dishonor. Philip dispatched his most discreet agents to gather proof. He expanded the Parliament of Paris's powers to try noble offenders, effectively bypassing feudal courts. Tax revenues once earmarked for chivalric tournaments were diverted to strengthen royal fortress, ironically using the scandal. S proceeds to buttress his own rule. Spies hid behind tapestry-lined walls. Guards were posted to record whispered passages. History remembers him both as the fair for his visage and the cruel for his unforgiving justice. His legacy endures in France as centralized state, and in the lesson that a ruler's public virtues can be undone by private view. When the knights were finally caught emerging from Margaret's chamber at dawn, still in partial disarray, the evidence was undeniable. torn silks, discarded tokens, and love letters penned in cipher. Public trial and harsh justice, and the precedent that even the king's household was subject to the law he commanded. Yet his moralizing rhetoric rang hollow to subjects who knew their monarch indulged in the very sins he punished. In 1314, a specially convened court, convened beneath Notre Dame's shadow. Political and familial fallout deeply in debt to the Templars. He orchestrated their mass arrest on charges of heresy and sexual deviance, smearing his zeal for purging courtly immorality. Their wealth vanished into the crown's coffers, their grand order dissolved. Thus, Philip's reign married fiscal expedience with moral spectacle on two grand stages. Dynastic shockwaves, the scandal rocked Europe. Allies withdrew ambassadors. Marriage negotiations collapsed. France's moral authority teetered. Centralization of power simultaneously. Philip used the crisis to consolidate authority. Legacy of hypocrisy and reform legal innovations under Philip's reign. France saw the codification of royal justice, a standing court, standardized procedures, the Templar catastrophe in 1307, Philip's crusade against the Knights Templar, presaged, the Tour de Nesles theatrics, a cautionary tale. Philip IV died in 1314. Legend says of gout complicated by stress, his public piety intact, but his private duplicity laid bare. Sigismund of Luxembourg. Envision the marble gallery of the Council of Constance, circa 1415. Bishops and princes clustered in heavy robes, debating heresy and church reform in hushed tones. Through the ornate door strides Sigismund of Luxembourg, tall, courtly, and ever the diplomat, yet beneath his scholarly facade lay a sovereign whose private life teemed with scandal. From a carousel of mistresses to secret trysts in disguise, he wove personal intrigue into the very fabric of European politics. Marital formality and extramarital enthusiasms. Queen Mary of Hungary, a union of convenience in 1385. Sigismund wed his cousin Mary, heir to the Hungarian throne, and for an invoice, wives each granted apartments, servants, and discreet pensions. Chroniclers joke that Sigismund collected consorts as others collected coins, often recalling one from her native court as a gift of diplomacy and dispatching another with a brief favor return letter. The marriage secured his claim to Hungary, Bohemia, and the empire, but the personal bond was negligible. Vienna, seeking local girls whose anonymity made for freer conversation. One popular tale describes him chatting up a tavern maid as Franz the Miller, only to spring his true identity midway through a coarse folk song. Much to her and the patrons' shock, Mary's health faltered early, and she withdrew from court life, leaving Sigismund free to cultivate a far more varied household. A gallery of consorts, Sigismund secretly built her a private chapel within his palace, complete with altar, confessional, and frescoes depicting their courtship. When the Duchy of Pomerania quarreled with Brandenburg, he dispatched his favorite mistress, Princess Anna of Pomerania, to negotiate peace, knowing her personal rapport with local nobles would succeed where knights failed. Her successful treaty in 1424 cemented his reputation as both lover and peacemaker. The Archbishop of Prague publicly lambasted the emperor's moral decay, accusing him of dragging the imperial dignity into brothels. Sigismund replied by granting the Archbishop Esegiocesius Dracicis an act seen as both bribe and slight. Letters reveal he signed dispatches to her as your devoted penitent, blending clerical formality with erotic devotion. Delegates noted his gravitas in church matters, but often snickered at his chamberlain's revelations of new ladies of virtue introduced during recesses. Sigismund never confined his affections to a single companion. His court register lists at least 9 named local opera singers, disguises, espionage, and courtesan courts. His widow Mary, the once forgotten queen, briefly reclaimed Hungary before the Habsburgs prevailed. Historians remember Sigismund as a shrewd statesman who shaped late medieval Europe, but also as a ruler who entwined diplomatic and erotic conquests so tightly that one cannot untangle his treaties from his secret visits and commoner guise. He famously ordered that any man caught with a prostitute be flogged, and any house of ill repute be razed. His motto, in all things virtue, first, adorned royal proclamations. Within palace walls, he sanctioned discreet pleasure houses for favored courtiers. Contemporary letters describe gilded salons where the king and his intimates sampled exotic wines and entertained ladies handpicked by royal sergeants and open, secret at court. Sigismund's fascination with espionage found a personal outlet. He regularly disguised himself in peasant garb to wander villages outside. Though intended as a light-hearted allegory of royal dominion over nature, the festivity descended into drunken book. Reports mention naked courtiers swinging from vines, while ladies-in-waiting performed satirical dances lampooning clergy. A mistress's private chapel, perhaps his most ambitious affair, involved Agnes Frankopin, a Croatian noblewoman. Political leverage through personal ties, arranged alliances, A royal commission convened to investigate whether the king himself had participated in indecent exposure. Louis deftly diffused the inquiry by declaring the event a harmless folly and sacking the magistrate who dared public complaint. King Louis VI bore his genial smile and promise of reform cuts a paradoxical figure. A ruler eager to outlaw debauchery yet famed for hosting the wildest nocturnal liaisons in his court. His 2-year reign ended as abruptly as his masked revels, thrusting his posthumous son John Ion onto the throne for 5 days before the infamous own death. His reforms outlived him. Subsequently, French monarchs invoked louis-seigismonds, extramarital liaisons, often dovetailed with political strategy, and the edicts that shape a kingdom may hide behind velvet curtains and masked balls. As the beloved, he remains a cautionary emblem of how a sovereign's public piety can coexist ironically with the most indulgent of private pleasures. Court intrigue and jealousy yet playing Cupid on a grand scale bred envy. Noble factions split between Sigismund's inner circle and devout clerics, who decried his courtly concubine network. Reflection and imperial consolidation. Their union produced a daughter, Joan, but the king's notorious philandering cast doubt on paternity. Rumors swirled that the child was fathered by a favorite courtier, a whisper that haunted Margaret's brief tenure as queen. Council of Constance. Amid this personal tumult, Sigismund presided over the council that ended the Western Schism, reuniting the papacy after 4 rival legacy of a discreet libertine. When Sigismund died of a stroke in 1437, he left no male heir. Louis X, the beloved of France. Imagine the spring of 1315 in the royal gardens of Chateau de Vin, where the air is heavy with the scent of blooming roses and the distant sound of harpists tuning. Piety and prohibition until sundown, champion of morality upon ascending in 1314. Louis initiated strict laws against brothels and public gambling. Private reversal. Yet when the evening's torches were lit, Louis's convictions dissolved. The Parcosinges scandal baronial backlash in late 1315. Louis hosted a midnight masque dubbed the Parcosinges, inviting nobles to dress as exotic creatures: apes, monkeys, parrots, and. Official inquiry news of the debacle reached Paris. Outraged burghers petitioned the parliament. Marriage, succession, and sudden death. Margaret of Burgundy. To secure the Capetian line, Louis married his cousin Margaret of Burgundy. Untimely demise in June 1316. Louis died unexpectedly, some say from pleurisy, aggravated by excess. Others from poisoning amid palace intrigues. Enduring irony of the beloved legacy of reform and hypocrisy. Historians often note Louis's earnest legal reforms against vice, yet record that his own court embodied the very moral chaos he condemned. Symbol of monarchical complexity. Louis' reign, though fleeting, reveals a perennial truth. Royal virtue often masks private vice.